Welcome, wanderer of the waking world. Lay down your thoughts and step softly into the realm between dreaming and remembering. Tonight's story weaves together two seekers of the soul, Carl Gustav Jung, the cartographer of the collective unconscious, and Simone de Beauvoir, the philosopher who dared to ask what woman becomes when freed from myth. Together and apart, they circled the question of essence and existence, one finding eternal patterns in the psyche's depths, the other insisting that we are nothing but what we make ourselves to be. As you settle into bed, let the rhythm of my voice carry you closer to sleep, one idea at a time. Relax as we explore how these two minds approach the mystery of human nature, one seeing archetypal forms that shape us from within, the other discovering freedom in the recognition that we are radically unfinished, always becoming. Their dialogue, whether spoken or across time, illuminates the vast territories of human consciousness. If you enjoy these quiet tales of psychological dialogue and wonder, press the like button and subscribe to join me on future journeys through the conversations between great minds. Tell me in the comments which psychological relationship intrigues you most: the mentor and student, the collaborators, the friendly rivals, and together we'll explore them in nights to come. Now, let the world fade. Drift with me through the intertwining paths of Jung and Simone de Beauvoir as we wander between their visions and listen to the echoes where their insights meet and part. In the year 1908, when Simone de Beauvoir had not yet been born, Carl Jung was already deep in his exploration of what he would come to call the collective unconscious. He sat in his study in Küsnacht, on the shores of Lake Zurich, surrounded by books on mythology, alchemy, and the religious visions of medieval mystics. Outside, the water lapped against the stones with an ancient rhythm, and Jung believed he could hear in that rhythm something older than language, older than consciousness itself. He was beginning to understand that beneath the personal memories and traumas of his patients lay something vaster, something shared across all humanity, patterns and images that repeated themselves in dreams, in myths, in the delusions of the mentally ill. These were the archetypes, the fundamental structures of the psyche, and among them he was beginning to discern certain consistent forms. There was the great mother, the wise old man, the hero, and there were also the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, the anima in men, the animus in women. These were not learned, Jung believed. They were inherited, built into the very architecture of human consciousness. 40 years later, in 1949, Simone de Beauvoir published The Second Sex, and with its opening salvo, "One is not born, but rather becomes a woman," she threw down a challenge to everything Jung had come to believe about the eternal feminine. She sat in the Café de Flore in Paris, cigarette in hand, surrounded by the existentialist circle that included Jean-Paul Sartre, Albert Camus, Maurice Merleau-Ponty, and she was constructing an argument that would shake the foundations of how we understand gender, identity, and freedom itself. For Beauvoir, there was no essential femininity waiting to be discovered in the depths of the unconscious. There was only the brutal fact of social conditioning, the weight of centuries of patriarchal myth and custom that had pressed women into the mold of the other, the inessential, the immanent being who serves as the ground for man's transcendent projects. These two thinkers never met. There is no record of Jung responding to The Second Sex, though it was published 5 years before his death in 1961. There is no evidence that Beauvoir ever engaged deeply with Jungian psychology. Though she certainly knew of it, It was part of the intellectual atmosphere of mid-century Europe, impossible to ignore entirely. And yet, their work speaks to each other across a chasm of fundamental disagreement, and in that chasm lies one of the most profound questions we can ask about human nature. Are we shaped by eternal patterns that exist prior to our individual existence, or are we radically free, self-creating beings whose identity is nothing but the sum of our choices and the social forces that constrain us? Let us begin at the beginning with the formation of these two remarkable minds, and let us move slowly, for there is no rush here in the quiet hours of the night. Carl Gustav Jung was born on July 26, 1875, in Keswil, Switzerland, the son of a Protestant pastor. His childhood was marked by a sense of isolation and an early awareness of what he would later call the two personalities within him. Personality number one, the schoolboy who lived in the world of everyday reality, and personality number two, a timeless, ancient presence who seemed to know things beyond the reach of ordinary knowledge. He grew up surrounded by religious imagery and theological debate, but also with a deep skepticism about the established church. His father's faith seemed hollow to him, a performance without genuine conviction, and this created in Jung a hunger for authentic spiritual experience that would shape all his later work. He studied medicine at the University of Basel and specialized in psychiatry, drawn to the field because it seemed to stand at the intersection of the material and the spiritual, the body and the soul. In 1900, he took a position at the Berg-Holzli Psychiatric Hospital in Zurich, under the direction of Eugen Bleuler, and there he began the work that would eventually bring him into contact with Sigmund Freud. Jung's early research involved word association tests, a method of revealing unconscious complexes by measuring patients' delayed or unusual responses to certain. This work caught Freud's attention, and in 1907 the two men met for the first time in Vienna, talking for 13 hours straight, recognizing in each other a kindred spirit in the exploration of the unconscious mind. But even from the beginning, there were differences. Freud saw sexuality as the primary driving force of the unconscious, the repressed energy that shaped neurosis and dream symbolism. Jung was never entirely comfortable with this reduction. He sensed something broader in the unconscious, something that could not be explained purely in terms of personal sexual history. When he began analyzing his own dreams and those of his patients, he found images that seemed to have no connection to the dreamer's personal life, images of ancient rituals, mythological figures, alchemical symbols that the dreamer had never consciously encountered. This led him gradually toward the concept of the collective unconscious, and it was this concept, along with his disagreements about the nature of libido and the role of spirituality in psychological health, that eventually caused the bitter break with Freud in 1913. After the break, Jung entered a period he would later call his confrontation with the unconscious, a time of psychological crisis during which he deliberately descended into his own inner world through active imagination, allowing images and figures to emerge from the depths. He recorded these experiences in what would eventually become known as the Red Book, a massive illuminated manuscript that he kept private during his lifetime. From these experiences emerged many of the core concepts of his mature psychology: the archetypes, the collective unconscious, the process of individuation, and the theory of psychological types. He spent the 1920s and 30s developing these ideas, studying alchemy, Gnosticism, Eastern religions, and the mythology of cultures around the world, always looking for the common patterns that underlay diverse cultural expressions. By the time Simone de Beauvoir was coming of age intellectually in the 1930s, Jung was an established figure, controversial perhaps, but widely known. His concept of the collective unconscious had entered the broader cultural conversation. His ideas about the anima and animus, the contrasexual aspects of the psyche, were particularly influential. Jung believed that every man carried within him an unconscious feminine component, the anima, and every woman carried an unconscious masculine component, the animus. These were not learned social roles, but archetypal structures, eternal forms that shaped how men and women related to the opposite sex and to the contrasexual aspects within themselves. A man projected his anima onto women in his life, falling in love with those who embodied some aspect of this inner image. A woman's animus might appear in dreams as a group of male figures representing opinion and judgment. The process of individuation, of becoming whole, required integrating these contrasexual aspects, acknowledging and developing them rather than projecting them outward. This was the psychological landscape into which Simone de Beauvoir was born on January 9th, 1908, in Paris, into a bourgeois family that would soon experience financial decline. Her childhood was marked by a strict Catholic upbringing, an education that emphasized duty and propriety, and a close friendship with another girl named Zaza, whose eventual death Beauvoir would always see as a kind of murder by social convention, a young woman destroyed by the expectations placed upon her by family and church. Beauvoir was intellectually brilliant from an early age, and she lost her faith in God during adolescence, a loss that freed her but also left her with an acute awareness of the absurdity of existence, the lack of any inherent meaning or purpose in the universe. She studied philosophy at the Sorbonne and the École Normale Supérieure, and in 1929, at the age of 21, she took second place in the highly competitive aggregation examination in philosophy. First place went to Jean-Paul Sartre, who was taking the exam for the second time, and their meeting in the preparation period for that exam marked the beginning of one of the most famous intellectual partnerships of the 20th century. They formed what they called a morganatic marriage, an alliance without legal or religious sanction, committed to radical honesty, intellectual collaboration, and mutual freedom. They would never live together permanently, never have children, and they explicitly rejected the conventional forms of marriage and monogamy, though their actual relationship was far more complex and often more painful than their public presentation of it suggested. Beauvoir spent the 1930s teaching philosophy at various lycées and working on her first attempts at fiction and philosophy. She was influenced by the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger, by the existentialism that Sartre was developing, and by her own experiences as a woman in a world that constantly reminded her of her secondary status. She noticed how women were defined always in relation to men, how female students were treated as intellectually inferior despite often superior performance, how women's ambitions were constrained and their achievements diminished. But she had not yet found the theoretical framework to make sense of these observations. The Second World War interrupted everything. Beauvoir lived through the occupation of Paris, continued teaching under increasingly difficult conditions, and when Sartre was captured and held as a prisoner of war for a time, she experienced directly the vulnerability and limitation of her position as a woman alone. After the war, as existentialism became the dominant intellectual movement in France, Beauvoir began to think seriously about writing a philosophical work on the situation of women. Sartre encouraged her, saying she should write about what it meant to be a woman. Her initial thought was that it meant nothing in particular, that she had never felt limited by her sex. But as she began researching and reflecting, she realized that her own experience of relative freedom was highly unusual, and that for most women, being female was indeed a defining and limiting condition. The research and writing of the second sex took her 2 years, from 1946 to 1948. She read anthropology, history, biology, psychoanalysis, and literature. She examined the myths and legends surrounding femininity across cultures. She studied the theories of Freud and his followers, and while she found some insights there, she was deeply critical of the biological essentialism that seemed to underlie psychoanalytic theory, the notion that anatomy is destiny, that women's psychology is fundamentally determined by their reproductive organs and their lack of a penis. If she encountered Jung's specific theories about the anima and animus during this research, she did not engage with them directly in the published work, but her entire argument was a refusal of exactly the kind of thinking Jung represented, the belief in eternal feminine essences, in archetypal forms that transcend history and culture. The Second Sex appeared in 2 volumes in 1949, and it was immediately controversial. The Vatican placed it on the Index of Forbidden Books. François Mauriac wrote to a colleague, "Now I know everything about your boss's vagina," Albert Camus, despite being part of the same intellectual circle, called it ridiculous. But it also found an immediate and passionate readership among women who recognized their own experience in Beauvoir's analysis. The book's central argument was both simple and revolutionary: that women have been systematically defined as the other throughout history, as the negative to man's positive, the immanent to his transcendence, the nature to his culture. This othering was not a biological necessity, but a social and historical construction, maintained through myth, through law, through custom, and through women's own internalization of their inferior status. In the opening pages of The Second Sex, Beauvoir takes on the question of woman's nature directly. She examines and rejects the biological argument that woman's reproductive capacity determines their destiny. She examines and rejects the psychoanalytic argument that women are defined by penis, envy, and a fundamentally passive sexuality. And she examines and rejects what we might call the mythological or archetypal argument, though she does not name Jung specifically. She writes about how cultures across time have created myths of the eternal feminine, projecting onto women the roles of mother, virgin, whore, muse, nature, matter, chaos always, as the other against which man defines himself as subject, as consciousness, as transcendence. These myths, Beauvoir argues, are not revelations of some deep truth about the feminine psyche. They are tools of oppression, ways of justifying and maintaining male dominance by making it appear natural, eternal, and inevitable. Here, then, is the fundamental divergence between Jung and Beauvoir. When Jung looked at the recurring images of the feminine in dreams, myths, and art, he saw the anima, an archetypal structure of the collective unconscious, a real and eternal aspect of the psyche that spoke to something true about the feminine principle and its mysterious otherness. When Beauvoir looked at the same recurring images, she saw patriarchy reproducing itself, saw men projecting onto women the aspects of themselves they refused to acknowledge, saw women being trapped in a prison of symbols and myths that prevented them from being recognized as fully human subjects with their own transcendent projects. Let us sit with this difference for a moment. As the night deepens around you and your breathing slows, These are not merely academic disagreements. They represent two fundamentally different ways of understanding what it means to be human, what freedom is, what the unconscious is, and whether there exists anything that could be called eternal or universal in human nature. For Jung, the unconscious was not simply a repository of repressed personal memories, as Freud had suggested. It was multi-layered. There was indeed a personal unconscious containing forgotten or repressed experiences from one's own life. But beneath that lay the collective unconscious, a dimension of the psyche inherited and shared by all humanity, containing the archetypes, fundamental patterns of human experience that manifested in the recurring motifs of world mythology, in the delusions of the insane, in the dreams of people who had never been exposed to the cultures whose symbols appeared in their sleep. The collective, unconscious was, in Jung's view, the source of profound wisdom, a connection to something transpersonal and numinous. To ignore it or to understand it merely as social conditioning was to cut oneself off from the deepest sources of meaning and vitality. The anima and animus were among the most important of these archetypes. Jung developed his understanding of them over many years, and his theories evolved, but the core idea remained consistent. The anima was the personification of the feminine in a man's unconscious, often appearing in dreams as a woman who could be a guide, a seductress, a source of inspiration, or poison depending on the man's relationship to his own unconscious feminine side. The animus in women was the masculine component, often appearing as plural, as opinions or judgments, as a group of men or a series of male figures representing different aspects of logos, of focused consciousness and critical thought. Jung saw these as necessary structures for psychological wholeness. A man who was cut off from his anima became rigid, overly rational, unable to relate emotionally. A woman who was possessed by her animus became dogmatic, opinionated in a rigid way, cut off from her own feeling and intuition. The path of individuation required integrating these contrasexual aspects, learning from them, developing the qualities they represented without being overwhelmed by them. And Jung believed that in the symbols of alchemy, in the mythological marriage of sun and moon, king and queen, he had found a map of this process, a symbolic language that had been handed down through centuries because it encoded something eternally true about the human psyche. But notice what this means. For Jung, there is indeed something that can be called masculine and something that can be called feminine at the archetypal level, prior to and deeper than any particular social arrangement. These are not reducible to the roles that men and women play in a given society. They are psychological realities, structures of the psyche itself. A woman who developed her animus was developing her capacity for focused, directed thinking, for assertion and analysis. A man who integrated his anima was becoming capable of emotional depth, relatedness, and intuitive knowing. This did not mean that women could not think or men could not feel, but it did suggest that there were qualities associated with masculinity and femininity at a fundamental level. For Beauvoir, this entire framework was suspect, a mystification that served to justify oppression. When she examined the mythology of femininity, she saw not eternal truths but historical constructions. She traced how women had been associated with nature, with the body, with matter, while men were associated with culture, with mind, with form-giving spirit. And she asked the crucial question, who benefited from this association? The answer was clear. Men benefited. By casting women as nature, as immanent, as the stable ground of domestic life, men freed themselves for the projects of transcendence, for art, for politics, for philosophy, for war, for all the activities through which human beings assert their freedom and create meaning in an absurd universe. The mythology of the eternal feminine was, in Beauvoir's analysis, a way of keeping women in their place. By telling women that their true nature was to be nurturing, emotional, intuitive, connected to the cycles of nature through their reproductive capacity, patriarchy convinced women to accept their confinement to the domestic sphere, to accept their economic dependence on men, to accept their exclusion from full participation in public life. And women internalized these myths, came to believe them, came to see their own subordination as natural and right, or at least as inevitable. Beauvoir's existentialism provided an alternative framework. Drawing on Sartre's formulation that existence precedes essence, she argued that human beings are not born with a fixed nature. We are, first of all, nothing pure freedom, pure possibility. We become something only through our choices and actions, and even then, we are never finished, never complete. We are always in the process of becoming. This meant that there was no such thing as a female essence, no eternal feminine, no archetypal woman. There were only women, plural, each one a subject with her own projects, her own freedom, her own responsibility to create herself. The tragedy was that women had been systematically denied the conditions necessary for exercising this freedom. Through law, custom, economic dependence, lack of education, and the internalization of myths about their nature, women had been made into objects rather than subjects, defined by their relationships to men rather than by their own autonomous projects. A woman was somebody's daughter, somebody's wife, somebody's mother, but rarely was she recognized as a subject in her own right, with her own transcendent aims. Beauvoir's call was for women to refuse this objectification, to reject the myths of femininity, to claim their own freedom and subjectivity. This did not mean becoming like men in the sense of adopting masculine characteristics. It meant becoming fully human, which was to say, becoming a being who asserts freedom, who undertakes projects that aim at transcendence rather than remaining trapped in immanence. Women had been confined to the repetitive cycles of domestic labor, to the biological cycles of reproduction, to the immanent sphere of maintaining life rather than transforming it. Liberation meant claiming the right to participate in the transcendent projects that had been reserved for men: intellectual work, creative work, political work, any form of labor that aims at changing the world rather than merely maintaining it. Now, in the quiet of this night, consider the two visions side by side. Jung sees the psyche as containing eternal patterns, and he sees the masculine and feminine as real psychological principles, neither superior nor inferior, both necessary for wholeness. Beauvoir sees the psyche as radically free, shaped by social conditions and personal choices, and she sees the association of men with masculinity and women with femininity as a historical construction that has served to justify women's oppression. For Jung, myth reveals psychological truth. For Beauvoir, myth conceals social oppression beneath a veil of naturalness and inevitability. Let us deepen this comparison by moving through the specific areas where their thinking converges and diverges. And let us take our time, for the night is long and there is no need to hurry toward conclusion. Begin with their understanding of freedom, for this is perhaps the most fundamental difference between them. For Beauvoir, freedom is the essential characteristic of human existence. We are, As Sartre put it, condemned to be free. We cannot escape our responsibility for who we become because even refusing to choose is a choice. This freedom is both exhilarating and terrifying, and much of human life is spent in what Sartre called bad faith, in denying our freedom, in pretending that we are determined by our nature, our circumstances, our past. Women, Beauvoir argued, have been particularly subject to this bad faith, told that their nature determines their destiny, that they are meant to be mothers and nurturers and helpmates, that their fulfillment lies in serving others rather than in undertaking their own projects. But this is a lie. Women are just as free as men, just as undetermined by biology, just as responsible for creating their own essence through their choices. For Jung, freedom is a more complicated matter. The process of individuation, which is Jung's term for psychological growth and maturation, does involve a kind of freedom, the freedom to become more fully oneself, to differentiate oneself from the collective, from the persona that one presents to the world, from the unconscious identification with one's parents and one's social role. But this freedom is achieved not by rejecting the unconscious, not by asserting pure will and choice, but by coming into right relationship with the unconscious. The ego, the center of consciousness, must learn to listen to the self, the archetype of wholeness and meaning that lies at the center of the psyche. The archetypes are not prisons, in Jung's view, but guides. They contain the accumulated wisdom of human experience over millennia. To individuate is to honor this wisdom while still maintaining one's individual integrity. So where Beauvoir emphasizes transcendence, the movement beyond what is given toward what one chooses to become, Jung emphasizes integration, the movement toward wholeness through dialogue with all aspects of the psyche, conscious and unconscious, personal and collective. Where Beauvoir is suspicious of anything that claims to be eternal or universal, seeing, in such claims, the danger of naturalizing oppression, Jung is devoted to discovering the eternal patterns, believing that connection to the transpersonal dimension of the psyche is essential for meaning and psychological health. Consider their different approaches to myth, for this difference illuminates much of the broader divergence between them. Jung spent decades studying mythology, not as a mere hobby, but as central to his psychological research. He read the myths of Greece and Rome, of the Germanic and Celtic peoples, of Christianity and Gnosticism, of alchemy and Kabbalah, of Hinduism and Buddhism and Taoism, of indigenous peoples of Africa, Australia, and the Americas. He looked for common patterns, for what he called motifs, that appeared across cultures that had no historical contact with each other. The hero's journey, the death and rebirth, the divine child, the wise old man, the great mother, the trickster. These figures appeared again and again, and Jung interpreted this recurrence as evidence for the collective unconscious. These were not learned motifs transmitted through cultural contact, but spontaneous products of the human psyche, arising from the archetypes. When Jung worked with his patient's dreams, he brought this vast mythological knowledge to bear. If a patient dreamed of descending into a cave and finding a treasure, Jung might think of the hero's descent into the underworld, might reference Orpheus or Odysseus or Christ's harrowing of hell. He believed the dream was expressing an archetypal pattern, that the patient was undergoing a psychological journey that had been undergone countless times before in the history of the human soul. The myth provided a context, a framework for understanding what was happening at an unconscious level. It connected the individual's struggle to something larger, showed that this was not merely a personal crisis but a human crisis, a stage in the eternal process of psychological transformation. For Beauvoir, this kind of thinking was precisely the problem. When she analyzed myths of femininity in the second sex, she looked at the same recurring motifs Jung might have called archetypal, but she interpreted them entirely differently. The Great Mother, the Virgin, the Whore, the Muse, these were not revelations of eternal feminine essences, but projections of male desire and anxiety. Men feared women's reproductive power, their connection to the processes of life and death, their otherness, and so they created myths to contain and control that fear. They elevated women to the status of goddesses, pure, nurturing, all-loving, and they also demonized women as witches, temptresses, destroyers. Both the elevation and the demonization served the same purpose: to deny women's full humanity, to prevent them from being seen as subjects with their own freedom and their own projects. Beauvoir traced how these myths changed across history, how they were adapted to serve the needs of different social arrangements. In patriarchal agricultural societies, the Great Mother might be honored because women's reproductive labor was valuable. In later periods, when property and inheritance became crucial, women's sexuality had to be strictly controlled, and the myth of the Virgin became ascendant. But none of these myths emerged from the collective unconscious as spontaneous expressions of eternal truth. They were tools of social control, and they were effective precisely because they presented themselves as natural, as expressions of eternal feminine essence, rather than as historical constructions serving male interests. Here we arrive at one of the deepest chasms between Jung and Beauvoir. For Jung, to reconnect with myth was to reconnect with the deep sources of meaning and wisdom in the collective unconscious. For Beauvoir, to be trapped in myth was to be denied one's freedom and subjectivity. Jung's psychological practice aimed at helping patients find their place in the eternal patterns. Beauvoir's philosophical and political project aimed at liberating women from the patterns that had been imposed upon them. Let us explore how this divergence played out in their understanding of gender itself. Jung's anima and animus theory was central to his psychology. Every man, he believed, carried within him an unconscious feminine component, and every woman carried an unconscious masculine component. These contrasexual aspects were necessary for wholeness. They also mediated one's relationship to the unconscious as a whole. For a man, the anima was the guide into the unconscious realm. For a woman, the animus played a similar role. Jung described 4 stages of anima development in men. At the most primitive level, the anima appeared as Eve, representing purely biological relationships. At the second level, she appeared as Helen of Troy, representing romantic and aesthetic fascination. At the third level, she appeared as Mary, representing spiritual love elevated beyond the purely personal. At the highest level, she appeared as Sophia, representing wisdom itself. Similarly, he described stages of animus development in women, though his discussion of the animus was generally less developed and more negative in tone, perhaps revealing some of the limitations of Jung's own perspective as a man of his time. What was Jung trying to capture with these concepts? He observed that men often projected qualities of emotional sensitivity, intuition, and relatedness onto women, and that they seemed to lack these qualities in themselves, or at least had difficulty accessing them consciously. He observed that women sometimes seemed possessed by a kind of rigid opinionatedness, by an animus that spoke through them in judgments and pronouncements that seemed disconnected from their own feeling and intuition. He believed that psychological health required developing the contrasexual qualities that men needed to become capable of the emotional and relational capacities they projected onto their animas, and women needed to develop their own capacity for focused thinking and assertion without being possessed by their animus. But notice what is being assumed here. There is an association between femininity and emotion, intuition, relatedness, and there is an association between masculinity and thinking, judgment, assertion. Jung would say, these are not social constructs, but archetypal truths, structures of the psyche itself. A man developing his anima is not learning something socially coded as feminine. He is accessing a fundamental dimension of his own psyche that happens to have feminine characteristics. Similarly, a woman developing her animus is not simply learning to be more aggressive or rational in a way that society codes as masculine. She is developing an aspect of her psyche that is truly masculine in character. Beauvoir would reject this entire framework. For her, the association of women with emotion and men with reason is precisely one of the core myths that needs to be challenged. It is not a psychological truth, but a social construction that has served to justify excluding women from intellectual and public life. Women have been told they are naturally more emotional, more intuitive, more connected to their bodies and to nature, and therefore less suited to abstract thought, to political leadership, to positions requiring rationality and judgment. This myth has been internalized by women themselves, who often hold themselves back from intellectual ambition or doubt their own rational capacities. The task is not to integrate masculine and feminine aspects of the psyche, but to recognize that qualities like reason, emotion, intuition, and assertiveness are human qualities, available to all regardless of sex. When a woman develops her capacity for focused, logical thought, in Beauvoir's view, she is not developing her animus. She is simply developing human capacities that have been falsely gendered. When a man develops his capacity for emotional sensitivity and relational attunement, he is not integrating his anima. He is recovering human capacities that he was taught to repress because they were coded as feminine and therefore inferior. The problem is not that men lack their feminine side or women lack their masculine side. The problem is that we have carved up human capacities along gender lines in a way that limits everyone's full human development, and that particularly limits women by reserving for men the qualities associated with transcendence, subjectivity, and full humanity. Let us pause here and breathe with this tension, for it is not easily resolved. Both Jung and Beauvoir are, in their own ways, arguing for human wholeness. Jung sees wholeness as requiring the integration of masculine and feminine principles. Beauvoir sees wholeness as requiring the recognition that these principles are false divisions, that we are not masculine or feminine, but human, and that we limit our humanity when we accept the gendered meanings that culture has imposed upon us. Listen to how they might speak to each other across this divide. Jung might say to Beauvoir, "You are right that social conditioning has limited women, that patriarchal societies have denied women full participation in cultural life. But in rejecting all talk of masculine and feminine, you throw out the baby with the bathwater. The archetypes are not social constructs. They appear spontaneously in the dreams of children, in the delusions of the isolated insane, in cultures around the world that have had no contact with each other. When you deny the reality of the anima and animus, you cut yourself off from a vast realm of psychological experience and wisdom. The task is not to reject the categories of masculine and feminine, but to honor them in their complementarity. to recognize that wholeness requires both principles. Beauvoir might respond, but who determines what counts as masculine and what counts as feminine? You draw on myths and symbols from patriarchal cultures, and you find recurring patterns, and you call these eternal truths. But all you have really found is that patriarchy has existed in various forms across many cultures, and that these cultures have created similar symbolic systems to justify male dominance. The recurring image of the feminine as mysterious, as nature, as the unconscious itself, is not evidence of an archetype. It is evidence of a common social structure in which men have held power and have projected onto women the qualities they refuse to see in themselves. Your anima is not a guide to the unconscious. It is a way of keeping women as other, as the mysterious feminine that can be contemplated, but never known as a fellow subject. Jung might insist, the anima is not women. This is the misunderstanding. The anima is a structure within the male psyche, and while men often project it onto actual women, causing all manner of relationship difficulties, the anima itself is an internal figure. When I speak of the feminine principle, I am not talking about women as they actually are. I am talking about a psychological reality, a dimension of the psyche that has feminine characteristics. Women have an animus, a masculine dimension, for the same reason because the psyche is structured in a compensatory way, balancing consciousness with its opposite in the unconscious. Beauvoir might counter. But where do these so-called feminine characteristics come from, if not from observing actual women as they have been shaped by patriarchal society? You say the anima is related to eros, to relatedness, to emotional life. These are precisely the qualities that women have been forced to develop because they have been excluded from the world of logos, of abstract thought and public action. You then take these socially produced qualities, observe that they appear in myths and dreams, and conclude that they are archetypal, eternal. But the myths and dreams are themselves products of societies that have gendered human qualities in this way. You are discovering not the structure of the psyche, but the depth to which patriarchal values have penetrated human consciousness. Neither would convince the other, for they begin from fundamentally different premises about the nature of the psyche and the relationship between the individual and the collective, the eternal and the historical. Let us shift our focus slightly and consider how they understood the process of becoming oneself, of achieving authenticity. For both Jung and Beauvoir, this was a central concern, but they conceptualized it very differently. Jung's process of individuation is a lifelong journey toward wholeness and self-realization. It involves differentiating oneself from the collective, from the persona that one wears in social life, from unconscious identification with one's parents and cultural roles. But it also involves integrating the shadow, the rejected aspects of oneself, the contrasexual dimension represented by the anima or animus, and ultimately achieving a relationship with the self, the archetype of wholeness that represents one's unique potential and one's connection to something transpersonal. Individuation is not about becoming completely unique or different from everyone else. It is about becoming who you truly are, which includes honoring both your individuality and your connection to the collective patterns of human existence. The individuated person, in Jung's view, has achieved a balance between conscious and unconscious, between individual and collective, between masculine and feminine within the psyche. Such a person is no longer driven by unconscious forces, but has brought those forces into awareness and integrated them. Such a person has found their own unique way of embodying the eternal patterns, has discovered their personal myth within the broader context of human mythology. There is often a spiritual or religious dimension to this process, though Jung was careful to distinguish between religion as a living connection to the numinous and religion as mere adherence to external dogma. For Beauvoir, authenticity involves something quite different. It involves recognizing one's radical freedom and taking responsibility for one's choices. It involves refusing bad faith, the self-deception by which we pretend we are not free, by which we hide from ourselves the burden of our liberty. It involves undertaking projects of transcendence rather than remaining trapped in immanence, engaging in work that transforms the world rather than merely maintains it. And for women specifically, it involves rejecting the myths and roles that have been imposed by patriarchy, refusing to define oneself through relationships to men, claiming one's own subjectivity. Beauvoir's authentic woman is not seeking wholeness through integration with an unconscious masculine principle. She is asserting her freedom, her right to participate fully in human projects regardless of her sex. She is rejecting the idea that she has a feminine nature or essence that determines what she should be. She is creating herself through her choices, her actions, her refusal to be defined by others. Notice how different these visions are. Jung's individuated person has achieved integration, balance, a right relationship with forces, both personal and transpersonal. Beauvoir's authentic person has achieved freedom, self-definition, the courage to create themselves in a universe without predetermined meaning. Jung looks inward and downward into the depths of the psyche. Beauvoir looks outward and forward, toward the future that one's choices and actions will create. Jung seeks to discover what is eternal. Beauvoir insists there is nothing eternal about human nature, that we are always in the process of becoming, never finished, never defined once and for all. Their methods of psychological exploration reflected these different orientations. Jung developed active imagination, a technique of deliberately engaging with unconscious contents by allowing images and figures to emerge and then interacting with them as if in a waking dream. He also worked extensively with dream analysis, interpreting dreams not primarily as disguised wish fulfillments, as Freud had, but as messages from the unconscious, as attempts by the psyche to compensate for one-sidedness in consciousness, as symbolic communications that use the language of myth and archetype. He encouraged patients to engage with their dreams, to paint or sculpt or write about the images that arose, to take seriously the symbolic dimension of psychic life. Beauvoir did not develop a therapeutic method, for she was a philosopher rather than a clinician, but her approach to understanding human psychology emphasized phenomenological description and existential analysis. She examined how people experienced their situation, how their freedom was constrained by social conditions, how they understood themselves in relation to others. She was less interested in dreams and symbols than in the concrete realities of how people lived, how they worked, how they related to their bodies, how they navigated the social roles and expectations that shaped their possibilities. When it came to understanding women's psychology specifically, Beauvoir's method was to examine women's lived experience in its social and historical context. She looked at how girls were raised differently from boys, how women's bodies were experienced as burden or trap rather than as source of power, how women's work was devalued, how women's sexuality was controlled, how women's intellectual and creative ambitions were discouraged. She interviewed women, read women's memoirs and literature, analyzed the myths and images surrounding femininity, and from all this, she constructed a comprehensive account of women's situation under patriarchy. Jung's approach to the feminine was quite different. He analyzed mythological images of goddesses and female figures, examined the anima figures that appeared in men's dreams, worked with female patients to understand their psychology, and from this he developed his theories of the feminine principle. But his method had a serious limitation, which is that he was a man analyzing femininity from the outside, as it were, and much of his data came from men's projections and fantasies rather than from women's own experiences of their subjectivity. Some of his female followers, particularly the analyst Tony Wolff, who was also his longtime lover, developed his ideas further and brought a more nuanced understanding of women's psychology. But the basic framework, with its association of the feminine with eros and relatedness and the unconscious, remained marked by a certain one-sidedness, as if the feminine were always that which is mysterious, that which must be integrated, that which men must come to terms with, rather than a form of subjectivity in its own right. Beauvoir was acutely sensitive to this problem of the feminine as other. She argued that throughout history, men had defined themselves as the essential, the absolute subject, the one, and had defined women as the other, as the negative, the object, the mysterious and incomprehensible. This othering was not an innocent philosophical or psychological mistake. It was the foundation of women's oppression. As long as women were seen as other rather than as subjects in their own right, they could be denied full humanity, denied access to transcendence, denied the possibility of defining themselves. When we examine Jung's anima theory through this lens, we can see what Beauvoir might object to. The anima is the feminine as it appears in the male unconscious, the feminine as mystery, as that which is not male, as the bridge to the unconscious realm. Even when Jung insisted that the anima was not women but a dimension of the male psyche, the very structure of the concept maintains the association of the feminine with otherness, with the unconscious, with that which must be integrated from outside rational consciousness. The masculine principle, logos, is associated with consciousness, with ego, with the light of awareness. The feminine principle, eros, is associated with the unconscious, with the shadow realm, with the mysterious depths. This mapping, Beauvoir might argue, simply recapitulates at a psychological level the ancient patriarchal pattern of associating men with culture and consciousness, women with nature and unconsciousness. Yet we must also acknowledge what Jung was trying to address. He observed, and any honest observer must acknowledge, that human beings seem to be drawn to symbolic systems that involve pairs of opposites, light and dark, sun and moon, heaven and earth, consciousness and unconsciousness, and yes, masculine and feminine. These pairs appear in mythologies around the world, in alchemical symbolism, in religious imagery. Jung interpreted this ubiquity as evidence that the psyche is structured in terms of opposites and their reconciliation, that the process of individuation involves holding the tension between opposites and allowing a third thing to emerge, a symbol of transformation that transcends the opposition. Beauvoir would not deny that these symbolic systems exist and are widespread, but she would insist that we must ask critical questions about them. Why is the masculine principle associated with light, consciousness, culture, and the feminine principle with darkness, unconsciousness, nature? Who benefits from this association? How does this symbolic system function to justify and perpetuate male dominance? And if we are to take seriously the notion that women are subjects with their own freedom and their own projects, Can we continue to use a symbolic language that casts the feminine as that which must be integrated, that which represents the unconscious and the mysterious? These questions have no easy answers, and Jung himself evolved in his thinking about gender over the course of his life, though he never fully escaped the limitations of his cultural moment. In his later writings, he acknowledged that his understanding of the animus was less developed than his understanding of the anima, and he relied increasingly on female analysts to articulate women's psychology. But he never questioned the fundamental premise that there was such a thing as a masculine principle and a feminine principle at the archetypal level. Let us turn now to consider dreams, for both Jung and Beauvoir had to grapple with the question of what our dreams mean and what role they play in psychological life. This is another area where their approaches diverged significantly. For Jung, dreams were one of the primary ways the unconscious communicated with consciousness. They were not simply, as Freud had suggested, disguised wish fulfillments that needed to be decoded to reveal the repressed sexual content. Dreams used a symbolic language that was both personal and collective. A dream might reference events from one's personal life, but it might also draw on mythological motifs that the dreamer had never consciously encountered, suggesting that the collective unconscious was participating in the dream's creation. Jung's method of dream interpretation was to amplify the dream images, to explore their mythological parallels, to consider what they might be compensating for in the dreamer's conscious attitude. If a person was living a very one-sided rational life, the unconscious might send dreams of chaotic or instinctual content to compensate. If a person was neglecting their inner life, the unconscious might produce dreams calling them inward. The figures in dreams were often personifications of aspects of the psyche, the shadow representing rejected parts of oneself, the anima or animus representing the contrasexual dimension, the wise old man or great mother representing aspects of the self. Jung took dreams very seriously, sometimes spending an entire therapeutic hour on a single dream image, exploring its associations and symbolic resonances. He believed that if you paid careful attention to dreams over time, you could see a pattern emerging, what he called a dream series, which revealed the unconscious process of individuation at work. The dreams were guiding the dreamer toward greater wholeness, offering images and insights that consciousness could not produce on its own. Beauvoir's existentialism had a very different relationship to dreams. For the existentialists, consciousness is characterized by intentionality. It is always consciousness of something, always directed outward toward objects in the world. Dreams, in which this intentional structure breaks down and we are no longer fully conscious agents, were somewhat problematic for existential philosophy. Sartre's early work, Being, and Nothingness barely mentions dreams, and when it does, it is to say that in dreaming we are not fully conscious, not fully free, and therefore dreams are of marginal philosophical interest. Beauvoir does not write extensively about dreams in her major works. When she discusses the imaginative life in the second sex, it is primarily to examine how women's imaginations are colonized by patriarchal myths, how young women dream of romance and marriage because they have been taught these are their destiny, how women's erotic fantasies are shaped by the roles available to them in a sexist society. The question is not what the archetypal content of these dreams might be, but how social conditioning shapes even the most intimate dimensions of psychological life. An existentialist approach to dreams might emphasize that they represent moments when we are not fully ourselves, not exercising our freedom, not taking responsibility for our self-creation. The images in dreams are not messages. from a wise unconscious, but simply the products of a consciousness no longer fully in control of itself. To take dreams too seriously, to see them as guidance from some deeper source, might even be a form of bad faith, a way of avoiding responsibility by claiming that some part of oneself beyond conscious control is determining one's path. Imagine, then, Jung and Beauvoir discussing a particular dream. A woman dreams she is in a forest, lost, and a mysterious female figure appears and leads her to a clearing where there is a well. The woman looks into the well and sees her own reflection, but it is somehow changed, older and wiser. Jung might interpret this as a beautiful image of the self calling the dreamer toward individuation. The forest represents the unconscious. The state of being lost represents the dreamer's disconnection from her deeper nature. The mysterious female figure is an anima figure, a guide from the unconscious, or perhaps an aspect of the self. The well is an ancient symbol of the feminine, of depth, of the source of life and wisdom. The changed reflection suggests that the dreamer is being shown her potential, what she might become if she undertakes the journey of individuation. Jung would explore what in the dreamer's conscious life might have prompted this compensatory image, what one-sidedness the dream is addressing, and he would encourage the dreamer to reflect on the image, perhaps to paint it or to engage in active imagination with the female figure, to learn what she has to teach. Beauvoir might approach the same dream very differently. She might ask what social myths about femininity might be operating in this dream. The lost woman needing guidance, the association of the feminine with mysterious natural settings, the figure of the wise woman or crone. These are familiar motifs from patriarchal mythology. The dream might reveal how deeply the dreamer has internalized these myths, how even in sleep she imagines herself as needing guidance from some external source rather than trusting her own autonomous capacities. Beauvoir might ask what in the dreamer's waking life has made her feel lost, what obstacles to her freedom and self-determination she is facing. Rather than seeing the dream as a message from a wise unconscious, she might see it as a symptom of the dreamer's situation, a reflection of her sense of disorientation in a world that has not given her the tools to define herself freely. Neither interpretation is self-evidently correct, and perhaps both capture something true. Jung's reading honors the dream's symbolic power, the sense that it is meaningful and contains wisdom. Beauvoir's reading maintains critical awareness of how power and social conditioning shape even the most intimate psychological processes. Jung sees the unconscious as ally and guide. Beauvoir sees the unconscious, insofar as she acknowledges it at all, as potentially colonized by oppressive ideologies that must be brought to consciousness and resisted. We are deep into the night now, and the comparison between Jung and Beauvoir has revealed not just different theories, but different visions of what it means to be human. Let us gather these threads together and reflect on what their dialogue, their tension, their mutual resistance illuminates about the nature of the psyche and the project of human liberation. Jung believed that the psyche had depths that could not be reduced to social conditioning or personal history. He believed in the reality of the unconscious as a creative force, as the source of symbols and meanings that could guide the process of individuation. He believed that human beings were not simply free-floating individuals, but were connected to something larger, the collective patterns of human experience encoded in the archetypes. To ignore this dimension was to cut oneself off from the sources of meaning and vitality. The task was not to escape the archetypes, but to enter into conscious relationship with them, to find one's unique way of embodying the eternal patterns. Beauvoir believed that human beings were radically free, that existence preceded essence, that we create ourselves through our choices. She believed that appeals to eternal patterns, to archetypes, to any fixed human nature were dangerous because they had so often been used to justify oppression, particularly the oppression of women. The task was not to integrate oneself with unconscious patterns, but to become conscious of how one had been shaped by social forces, to refuse the limits that had been imposed, to assert one's freedom and create one's own meaning in the face of an absurd universe. These are not easily reconciled perspectives. And yet, as you lie here in the darkness, breathing slowly, perhaps you can sense that both are reaching toward something true, that the tension between them is not a mistake to be resolved, but a living dialectic that reveals the complexity of human existence. Jung's greatest strength is his recognition that human beings need meaning, need connection to something larger than the individual ego, need symbols and myths that resonate at a deep level. His psychology offers a path for those who feel the presence of something numinous, who sense that their dreams and inner experiences point toward realities that cannot be explained purely in terms of social conditioning or brain chemistry. Jung provides a framework for honoring the spiritual dimension of life without requiring adherence to traditional religious dogma. His work has helped countless people make sense of their psychological suffering, their creative process, their spiritual yearning. Jung's greatest weakness, and here Beauvoir's critique has force, is that his archetypal framework can too easily become a way of justifying existing social arrangements. If there is an eternal feminine principle associated with relatedness and emotion, if women naturally have these qualities and men naturally have others, then it becomes easy to argue that traditional gender roles are natural and right, that women should focus on relationships and men on achievement. Jung himself did not always draw these conservative conclusions, but his framework has been used this way by others, and his insistence on finding eternal patterns can blind him to the ways that power and oppression shape what appears to be natural or universal. Beauvoir's greatest strength is her uncompromising commitment to freedom and her penetrating analysis of how oppression works through myth and ideology. She reveals how women have been denied full humanity, how social structures and cultural stories have limited women's possibilities, and she insists that these structures are not natural or eternal, but historical and therefore changeable. Her work has been foundational for feminist theory and practice, providing both an analysis of oppression and a vision of liberation. She refuses to allow any appeal to nature or essence to justify limiting human freedom. Beauvoir's greatest weakness, and here Jung's approach has something to offer, is that her existentialism can sometimes seem thin, lacking resources for dealing with the full depth and complexity of psychological life. If we are nothing but what we make ourselves through our choices, if there is no human nature, no unconscious depth, no connection to anything transpersonal, then where do meaning, purpose, and a sense of belonging come from? Beauvoir acknowledges that we must create meaning through our projects, but she offers little guidance for how to do this in a sustained way. Her framework is powerful for analyzing oppression and asserting freedom, but less powerful for addressing questions of meaning, spirituality, and psychological healing. Perhaps what we need is not to choose between Jung and Beauvoir, but to hold their insights in tension, to use each as a corrective to the excesses of the other. We might acknowledge, with Jung, that human beings need symbols, need connection to something larger than the individual ego, need ways of understanding our psychological experiences that honor their depth and complexity. Dreams myths, and symbols are powerful, and they do seem to draw on common patterns across cultures. There may indeed be something we could call the collective unconscious, a shared dimension of human experience that manifests in recurring images and themes. But we must also acknowledge, with Beauvoir, that these symbols and myths have never been politically innocent. The recurring image of the Great Mother, for instance, may reflect something about human experience of the maternal, but it has also been used to confine women to motherhood, to suggest that women's primary value lies in their reproductive capacity. The association of women with nature and men with culture may reflect observations about different social roles, but it has also justified excluding women from public and intellectual life. We must bring critical awareness to our symbols, must ask who benefits from particular mythological constructions, must be willing to challenge and revise our symbolic systems when they perpetuate injustice. Similarly, we might acknowledge, with Beauvoir, that human beings are indeed free in a radical sense, that we are responsible for creating ourselves, that we are not determined by our biology or by eternal essences. Women are not destined by their nature to be emotional or relational, and men are not destined to be rational or aggressive. These associations are cultural constructions that have limited human flourishing. We must resist any framework that naturalizes gender hierarchy or that suggests that oppression reflects some eternal truth about masculinity and femininity. But we must also acknowledge, with Jung, that pure freedom can be overwhelming, even terrifying, and that human beings need guidance, need connection to patterns and meanings that transcend the individual will. The existentialist injunction to create one's own values can lead to a kind of nihilistic despair or to an exhausting voluntarism where everything must be constantly chosen and justified. Jung's archetypes, his sense of the self as a guiding presence, his use of myths as maps of psychological territory, these provide resources that can help people navigate the journey of self-development in a way that feels meaningful and connected to something larger. What would a synthesis look like? It might begin by recognizing that symbols and archetypes are real, that they have power, that they appear spontaneously in dreams and myths and shape human experience, but that they are also always historically situated, always shaped by power relations, always in need of critical interrogation. The Great Mother is a powerful archetype that speaks to experiences of nurturance, protection, and the source of life, but the Great Mother, as she has actually appeared in patriarchal cultures, has often functioned to limit women's possibilities. The hero's journey is a powerful archetypal pattern that speaks to processes of growth, struggle, and transformation, but the hero's journey, as traditionally told, has centered male experience and relegated women to the roles of prizes, temptresses, or helpers rather than protagonists of their own stories. We might use Jungian tools, dream work, active imagination, attention to symbols, while also maintaining Beauvoirian critical consciousness about how power and oppression shape even our most intimate psychological experiences. We might honor the depths of the psyche while also insisting on freedom. We might seek individuation while also resisting any definition of what it means to be a woman or a man that limits human possibilities. This is not easy work. It requires holding paradoxes, tolerating ambiguity, refusing premature synthesis. It requires being willing to say both that there is wisdom in ancient symbols and that ancient symbols have been used to oppress. It requires honoring both depth and freedom, both integration and transcendence, both the journey inward and the journey outward into the world. Consider how a contemporary depth psychology, informed by both Jung and Beauvoir, might approach the question of gender. It might acknowledge that gender has symbolic and archetypal dimensions, that images of masculine and feminine appear in dreams and myths and carry psychological meaning. But it might also insist that these symbolic dimensions are not fixed or natural, that the qualities associated with masculinity and femininity shift across cultures and history, that they are always being negotiated and contested, and that they have often functioned to justify oppression. It might work with the symbolic dimensions of gender in therapy while also supporting clients' freedom to define their own gender identity and expression, recognizing that the archetypal meaning of gender is one thing and the lived experience of gender in a hierarchical society is another. Or consider how such a psychology might approach women's psychology specifically. It might take seriously Jung's observation that integration of what he called the animus, the capacity for focused thinking, assertion, and independent judgment, is important for women's development. But it would reject the notion that these capacities are foreign to women's nature, something masculine that must be integrated from outside. Instead, it would recognize these as human capacities that women have been systematically discouraged from developing, and it would see women's reclamation of these capacities not as integration of the masculine, but as recovery of their full humanity. It might use Jungian dream work and symbolic exploration, while also incorporating Beauvoirian analysis of the social forces that have shaped women's psychology. As dawn approaches, as the deepest part of the night gives way, slowly to the first intimations of light, let us reflect on what the dialogue between Jung and Beauvoir reveals about the nature of psychological understanding itself. Both Jung and Beauvoir were, in their own ways, liberatory thinkers. Jung sought to free people from neurotic suffering, from identification with the persona, from possession by unconscious forces. His goal was individuation, the achievement of psychological wholeness and authentic selfhood. Beauvoir sought to free people, especially women, from oppression, from bad faith, from confinement in roles and identities that denied their freedom. Her goal was authentic existence, the recognition and exercise of radical freedom. The tension between them reveals that liberation is not a simple concept. Does it mean freedom from external constraint, the removal of social and political obstacles to self-determination? Or does it mean freedom through integration, achieving wholeness by coming into right relationship with all aspects of the psyche, including the unconscious? Must we choose between these two visions of freedom, or can we find a way to honor both? Jung might say that Beauvoir's existential freedom, without depth, without connection to the unconscious and the transpersonal, becomes abstract and unsustainable. Pure choice, pure freedom, without guidance from the deeper wisdom of the psyche, leads to exhaustion, meaninglessness, or willful inflation of the ego. The person who believes they are purely self-creating, who recognizes no authority beyond their own will, loses touch with the sources of meaning and risks falling into inflation or despair. Beauvoir might respond that Jung's integration, without critical consciousness, without attention to power and oppression, becomes conservative and justifies the status quo. The person who seeks to integrate with archetypal patterns without asking whose interests those patterns serve risks accommodating themselves to oppression, accepting their limitations as natural and eternal. The woman who seeks to integrate her animus without questioning why traditionally masculine qualities were denied to women in the first place has not achieved true liberation, but only a deeper internalization of patriarchal values. Both criticisms have merit. And yet both thinkers were grappling sincerely with the problem of human flourishing, asking what it means to live well, to achieve authentic selfhood, to overcome the obstacles to full humanity. They simply had different conceptions of what the obstacles were. For Jung, the primary obstacle was the ego's disconnection from the unconscious, the one-sidedness of modern rational consciousness cut off from its roots in the transpersonal. For Beauvoir, the primary obstacle was oppression, the social structures and ideological myths that denied people, especially women, the possibility of exercising their freedom. Perhaps the truth is that both obstacles are real, that we face both internal and external constraints on human flourishing. We are indeed shaped by unconscious forces, by patterns that transcend individual consciousness, by needs for meaning and connection that cannot be satisfied through will alone. And we are also shaped by power relations, by social structures that limit possibilities, by myths that naturalize oppression. Full liberation requires attention to both dimensions. The dream life that Jung explored so carefully is real. Our dreams do speak in symbols, do draw on cultural images, do reveal dimensions of experience not accessible to ordinary consciousness. But Beauvoir is right that we must not simply accept the content of dreams or myths uncritically. We must ask how power and oppression have shaped even our unconscious life, how the myths we dream are also the myths that have been used to limit us. The freedom that Beauvoir championed is real. We do have the capacity to choose, to define ourselves, to refuse the roles that have been assigned to us. But Jung is right that pure voluntarism is not enough, that we need connection to something larger. That meaning cannot be created solely through individual will, but requires some sense of participation in a meaningful cosmos. In the end, Jung and Beauvoir need each other. Jung needs Beauvoir's critical consciousness, her refusal to accept oppression as natural, her insistence on freedom. Beauvoir needs Jung's depth, his recognition of the unconscious, his tools for working with symbols and dreams in the inner life. A psychology that combines their insights would be both deep and critical, both honoring the symbolic dimension of experience and maintaining awareness of how power shapes that dimension. Such a psychology would work with dreams, but would also analyze how social myths colonize the dream space. It would explore archetypal patterns, but would also ask how those patterns have functioned historically, who has benefited from them, how they might need to be revised. It would support individuation while also supporting social justice, recognizing that personal wholeness and collective liberation are not separate projects, but aspects of the same struggle for full humanity. This integrated approach would recognize that the psyche is both deep and situated, both timeless and historical. There may indeed be archetypal patterns, common structures of human experience, but these archetypes are not fixed or unchanging. They evolve as human consciousness evolves. They take different forms in different cultures, and they are always subject to abuse, always at risk of being used to justify oppression. The task is not to reject archetypes entirely, but to work with them consciously, critically, creatively. Consider the archetype of the mother, which appears in some form in every culture. There is likely something archetypal about the experience of being mothered, of having one's needs met or unmet by a primary caregiver in early life, of the mother as source of life and nurturance. This experience shapes psyche in fundamental ways, and the image of the mother appears in dreams, myths, and religious symbolism across cultures. But the mother archetype, as it has actually appeared in patriarchal cultures, has often functioned to limit women to motherhood, to suggest that women find their primary fulfillment in bearing and raising children, to naturalize the arrangement where women do the unpaid labor of social reproduction while men pursue public and economic goals. A critical depth psychology would honor the archetypal dimension of mothering, while also analyzing how mother has been constructed to serve patriarchal ends. It would support women's freedom to choose whether to become mothers, would value women's other projects as equally important, would work toward a society where the labor of care is valued and shared rather than invisibly borne by women. It would recognize that men too have psychological relationships to the mother archetype, that they too were mothered, and that the traditional construction of masculinity that requires men to separate from the mother and prove they are not feminine is psychologically damaging. Or consider the archetype of the hero, which Jung and his follower Joseph Campbell explored extensively. The hero's journey leaving home, facing trials, descending into darkness, achieving transformation, returning with a boon for the community is a pattern that appears across mythologies and that does seem to map onto processes of psychological growth. But the hero has traditionally been male, and women's journeys toward wholeness have been understood either as supporting the male hero or as different in kind, focused on relationship and nurturance rather than adventure and achievement. A critical depth psychology would ask how the hero's journey might need to be revised to include women's experience as subjects rather than as helpers or obstacles. It might recognize that women, too, undertake heroic journeys, but that these journeys often take different forms because women face different obstacles. A woman's heroic journey might involve claiming her own voice in a culture that teaches women to be silent, developing her intellectual capacities in a society that tells her she is naturally less rational, refusing the role of caregiver to pursue her own projects in a world that punishes women for such refusal. The archetypal pattern of transformation through trial is real, but the specific form it takes is shaped by social position, by gender, by race, by class. This is the synthesis that the dialogue between Jung and Beauvoir points toward a psychology that is both deep and critical, that honors both the archetypal and the existential, that recognizes both the patterns that connect us to something larger and the freedom that allows us to transform those patterns. It is a psychology that takes seriously both the inner journey and the outer struggle for justice, recognizing that these are not separate but intertwined. In the silence of this night, as consciousness drifts between waking and sleep, between thought and dream, we can hold this tension without needing to resolve it. We can appreciate Jung's profound exploration of the psyche's depths, his articulation of the collective unconscious, his use of myth and symbol as tools for understanding psychological experience. And we can simultaneously appreciate Beauvoir's uncompromising insistence on freedom, her analysis of how oppression operates through myth and ideology, her refusal to allow any appeal to nature or essence to justify limiting human possibilities. Their disagreement is not a problem to be solved, but a creative tension that keeps alive important questions. Questions about nature and nurture, essence and existence, determinism and freedom, the personal and the collective, the eternal and the historical. These are questions that cannot be answered once and for all. They must be asked anew in each era, in each life, in each moment of self-reflection and choice. Jung reminds us that we are more than our conscious intentions, that depths within us connect to something larger, that symbols and dreams and myths carry meanings that transcend individual understanding. He invites us to listen to the unconscious, to pay attention to the images that arise spontaneously, to engage in dialogue with the figures that appear in our inner world. He offers a framework for understanding psychological suffering not merely as pathology to be eliminated, but as meaningful, as a call from the self toward greater wholeness. Beauvoir reminds us that we are free, radically and terrifyingly free, responsible for creating ourselves through our choices. She warns us against accepting limitations as natural or eternal, against using appeals to essence or nature as excuses for failing to exercise our freedom. She offers a framework for understanding how oppression operates through internalized myths and roles, and she calls us to resist, to refuse, to insist on our right to define ourselves. In the space between these two great thinkers, in the dialogue they never had but that their works create across time, lies a rich terrain for psychological exploration. It is a space where we can honor both depth and freedom, where we can work with symbols while maintaining critical awareness, where we can seek wholeness while also seeking justice. As the night reaches its deepest point, before the first bird sings and the sky begins its slow shift toward dawn, rest in this tension. You need not resolve it. You need not choose between Jung's vision and Beauvoir's, between archetypal psychology and existential freedom. You can hold both, can draw on whichever is most helpful in any given moment, can allow the tension between them to keep your understanding supple and alive. If you are suffering from a sense of meaninglessness, from disconnection, from the flatness of a life lived only on the surface, Jung's approach offers resources, dream work, active imagination, attention to symbols, the search for a personal myth within the larger patterns of human experience. If you are suffering from oppression, from the weight of roles and expectations that deny your freedom, from the internalization of myths that tell you what you should be, Beauvoir's approach offers resources: existential analysis, refusal of bad faith, assertion of freedom, critical examination of the social forces that have shaped you. And if you are grappling with both, with the need for meaning and the need for freedom, with the call from the depths and the call to transcendence, then you can draw on both, can create your own synthesis, can find your own way of honoring both the archetypal and the existential dimensions of human experience. The conversation between Jung and Beauvoir continues in the work of contemporary thinkers who are trying to integrate depth, psychology, with social justice, trying to develop a psychology that honors the unconscious while also maintaining critical awareness of power and oppression. Feminist, Jungian, analysts, liberation psychologists, narrative therapists, and others are creating new frameworks that draw on both traditions, that seek to be both deep and critical, both transformative and liberatory. This work is ongoing, unfinished, always needing to be renewed in response to new forms of oppression and new psychological insights. The dialogue between Jung and Beauvoir is not a historical artifact, but a living conversation that each generation must take up anew, asking again how we can be both free and connected, both individual and collective, both historically situated and in touch with something that transcends history. As you drift toward sleep now, as the words fade and consciousness loosens its grip, let yourself rest in the questions rather than the answers. Let yourself feel the pull of both visions, Jung's invitation to depth and Beauvoir's call to freedom. Notice how your own life involves both dimensions, how you are shaped by forces larger than yourself and yet also responsible for creating yourself through your choices. Your dreams tonight may speak in Jungian symbols, in archetypal images that connect to something larger. Pay attention to them, honor them, see what they have to teach. But also, as Beauvoir might remind you, question them. Ask what social myths might be operating in your dream space. Ask how power and oppression might have shaped even your unconscious life. Hold both attitudes at once, reverence for the symbolic and critical awareness of the social. Your waking life tomorrow will involve choices, moments where you must decide who you are and who you will become. In those moments, remember Beauvoir's insistence on freedom, on your responsibility to create yourself, on your right to refuse the roles that others would assign to you. But also remember Jung's reminder that you are not only conscious will, that you have depths, that wisdom can come from within if you learn to listen, that you are part of something larger than your individual existence. The tension between Jung and Beauvoir is ultimately a tension within each of us, between our need for meaning and our need for freedom, between our connection to something larger and our individual uniqueness, between the patterns that shape us and our capacity to transform those patterns. This tension is not a problem but a source of creative possibility. It keeps us alive, keeps us growing, prevents us from settling into either one-sided rationalism or one-sided mysticism, either existential isolation or collective fusion. In holding this tension, we participate in a larger dialogue about what it means to be human, a dialogue that has been going on for millennia and will continue long after we are gone. We stand between Jung's depth psychology and Beauvoir's existentialism, between the collective unconscious and radical freedom, between archetype and existence. And in standing there, in refusing to choose one absolutely over the other, we honor the full complexity of human life. May you sleep deeply, dream richly, and wake with a sense of both your depths and your freedom. May you find your own way of integrating these two visions, your own balance between honoring the patterns and creating yourself anew. May you be both connected and free, both deep and authentic, both individual and collective. May you live the dialogue between Jung and Beauvoir in your own life, allowing their tension to generate insight, creativity, and transformation. The night is nearly done. The story of these two great thinkers and their unspoken conversation has been told, but the conversation itself continues in your dreams, in your choices, in your ongoing journey toward wholeness and freedom. Rest now in that knowledge, in the sense that you are part of something larger, a centuries-long dialogue about the nature of the soul and the meaning of human existence. The last words tonight belong not to Jung or Beauvoir, but to the silence between them, to the space where their visions meet and diverge, to the question that their lives and works pose to each of us. How will you be both deep and free, both connected to eternal patterns and radically self-creating, both shaped by the collective unconscious and responsible for your own becoming? This question has no single answer. It must be lived, experimented with, discovered anew each day. And in living it, you participate in the great dialogue between these two ways of understanding the soul. Sleep now, wanderer. Dream of depths and freedom, of archetypes and existence, of integration and transcendence. When you wake, the dialogue continues, the tension remains, and in that tension lies the possibility of a fuller humanity, one that refuses to choose between its depths and its freedom, one that insists on being both grounded and in flight, both ancient and ever new. May you carry forward this dialogue in your own way, in your own life, in your own unique synthesis of what Jung and Beauvoir have taught us about the infinite complexity of the human soul. Good night.